Hey, what's going on, guys? This is my final video on helping exonerate the U.S. soldiers involved in the No Gun Ray incident in the Korean War. And I've done videos on this before. Final video, and I know I've done a good job. I just hope I can do a better job with this video. Praise Jesus if I do. Confident yet humble. All right, talk about No Gun Ray. Okay. No Gun Ray happened July 26 to July 29th, 1950. I've talked about this before, but today I read a book called No Gun Ray, The Bridge at No Gun Ray. And the book is very critical of the U.S. government's policies in the Korean War, as well as some of the U.S. soldiers, more the government than the soldiers. But I still prefer Robert Bateman's book, No Gun Ray, A Military History incident of during the Korean War. A military history incident during the Korean War. All right, let me explain this. Okay, the book that I just read, I'll show it to you right here. Show it to you. Book that I just read. There you go. Bridge at No Gun Ray. Book that I just read. Really did not emphasize the two guns that were found near the refugees at No Gun Ray. One was a Russian or Soviet-made burp gun, also a Japanese-made rifle. This was from when Japan occupied Korea from 1910 to 1945, and that was common practice. James Brady, who was a U.S. Marine during the Korean War, talks about how North Korean and Chinese soldiers would disguise themselves as regular civilians, sometimes go as far as disguising themselves as women. James Brady was a U.S. Marine during the Korean War. He wrote a book called The Coldest War, and he talks about that. And the regiment that was at No Gun Ray was the 7th Cavalry Regiment. Well, the 1st Cavalry Division published reports talking that they were worried about infiltration, that North Koreans were disguising themselves as regular civilians or refugees and trying to infiltrate. Life magazine, which was a popular magazine at the time, they reported that the Korean War was unlike any other war the U.S. had fought, that a lot of North Koreans would disguise themselves as refugees, have an ox cart, and the ox cart would be full of guns. Or like in the Battle of Daejeon, what they did was North Korean snipers disguised themselves as refugees. There was one time where Major General William F. Dean in the Battle of Daejeon refused to fire on refugees with his artillery. He had the orders to do so, but he refused to fire on the refugees. He said, "I'm not doing this." Well, I'll tell you how William F. Dean got captured. All public information. William F. Dean saw two guys he thought were South Korean civilians that were trying to help him. But the South Korean civilians helped him. They carried his stuff, but only for a little while. They led him to a trap with North Koreans. So these South Korean civilians were either North Korean soldiers or they were communist guerrillas. And there were a lot of communist guerrillas in the Jilishan Mountains. And these communist guerrillas would hide behind famous Korean historical sites, so the U.S. and South Korean planes couldn't bomb them. And if you did not join the communist guerrilla cause, you got shot, or you were horribly ill-treated. The book Bridge at No Gun Ray does not mention that. The book does mention that after the No Gun Ray incident, a lot of U.S. soldiers the next day did go administer medical care to the victims at No Gun Ray. That the book does note that. The book talks about also the Bridge at No Gun Ray. Talks about that the U.S. soldiers did not fire first. They don't emphasize the other shot very much, but they do emphasize that the U.S. soldiers heard a shot from somewhere else. Now, Robert Bateman's book heavily emphasizes that portion. And also, the soldiers at No Gun Ray, the U.S. soldiers, had not slept for about 2 days. One day earlier, they accidentally fired on South Korean soldiers escorting Korean refugees. Did not document if any deaths occurred or not, but the soldiers were highly sleep deprived. They were not as adequately trained as they could have been, because during that time, the U.S. Army budget the military budget, the U.S. military budget went from $82 billion to $13.2 billion, and the U.S. Army's budget was only $4 billion. A lot of these soldiers in the 7th Cavalry were too young for World War II, so they didn't serve in World War II, and the U.S. occupation of Japan was a lot easier than expected. So they were not adequately trained when they first got to Korea. Now, it changed as the war progressed, but this was still the early part of the Korean War. And so they were sleep deprived, not adequately trained. Okay, third, there was also a language barrier. Okay, the language barrier, they stopped the refugees and were calling to get South Korean soldiers in there to interpret for them so they could check the refugees. So the U.S. soldiers could check the refugees. Well, between that time, the shot occurred. And before the shot occurred, there were airstrikes. Now, some of the refugees talk about that they saw a U.S. soldier on the radio. They believe that U.S. soldier ordered the airstrike. Well, around that time, there's conflicting reports. Some of the refugees said that those planes only used their guns. Some say they used their rockets. So that's conflicting reports. Some say they used the guns. Some say they used the guns and the rockets. That's number one. Number two, also around that time, the U.S. Air Force planes accidentally bombed a key U.S. Army office building. So sometimes in war, coordinates can get mixed up. Doesn't mean somebody intentionally tried to massacre somebody. It wasn't a massacre. It was an incident. Why would the U.S. try to be killing their own people? Okay? And that happened. Okay, that happened before the shot was fired. Okay, and when the shot was fired, the refugees went down to the bridge. And a lot of the shots that were fired over the refugees' heads. Now, some civilians died in an era of confusion because a shot was fired elsewhere. 2 guns were recovered amongst the refugees. Some of the refugees had also said they were worried about their group being infiltrated by North Korean soldiers or communist guerrillas. And the refugees told the U.S. soldiers that. And the little Japanese the U.S. soldiers knew, the U.S. soldiers could talk to them with that. They communicated in Japanese. Yes, the refugees were Korean. I know that. This is talking about the Korean War. But Japan occupied Korea between 1910 and 1945. And the U.S. soldiers knew some Japanese. Most Koreans were very proficient in it. And the refugees testified that. Also, of the 49 refugees that testified, only 4 reported hostile behavior by the U.S. soldiers. And even one of the ones who reported hostile behavior by the U.S. soldiers, after No Gun Ri, some U.S. soldiers found her and they took her to an orphan area, allowed her to be orphaned. This girl lost her parents in No Gun Ri. So, point being is that, and then also some of the ones that reported hostility, the U.S. Army Jeep took them part of the way to safety. So, even the ones who reported hostility reported a lot of good in a lot of the U.S. soldiers. And the book, Bridget No Gun Ri, notes that, even though they're critical of a lot of things. Also, the book, though, does not emphasize how heavily North Korea did their guerrilla program. The reason they had the Katusa program was started in the Korean War, Korean augmentation in the U.S. Army, is so they could weed out who were really South Korean soldiers and who were North Koreans dressed as South Korean soldiers. Okay? In the Battle of Osan, the book The Korean War by Max Hastings, note this, there were North Koreans disguised as South Korean soldiers. And they came up, they started talking to this one U.S. Soldier and these South Korean soldiers, and then they started running. They started running because the South Korean soldier figured out they were North Koreans. That happened. You can read the book The Korean War by Max Hastings. Notes that. That happened in the first battle of the Korean War, the Battle of Osan. And also, the Tiger Death March was where many U.S. POWs, South Korean POWs, as well as ministers and aid workers. I can think ministers and aid workers. They were imprisoned by North Koreans, and the reason they got imprisoned in the first place is because North Koreans disguised themselves as South Korean soldiers and led them to a trap. It happened. So you can't rule this as a massacre after all the stuff North Korea did, where where the U.S. soldiers didn't know who the enemy was, you can't say it's a massacre. Also, Robert Carroll was there during No Gun Re, and there were some U.S. soldiers, a minority, that like taking shots at South Korean civilians, and Robert Carroll notes they were in the minority. He told them to stop. One of them did, but Robert Carroll went and got the refugee that was shot and got the surgeon to tend to him. The book, The Bridge at No Gun Re, makes no mention of that. No mention of that. And yeah, that's what happened. And and the Associated Press brought the No Gun Re incident up. It was brought upon by Edward Daly. Daly was not even at No Gun Re. The Bridge at No Gun Re notes that. And Daly really convinced people that he was there. Eugene Hesselman, who may or may have not been at No Gun Re, said, Daly was there. I know he was. So Robert Bateman thinks Daly's testimony is very influential, whether if it was a massacre or an incident, because Daly really drilled in people's minds that No Gun Re happened the way he said it. Daly also lied, said he got a direct battlefield commission when he didn't, that he did not go from enlisted to officer in the battlefield. Daly was a mechanic during the Korean War. He was in the U.S. Army during the Korean War, but he was a mechanic. He was not with the 7th Cavalry at No Gun Re. And the book notes that Daly's testimony is just light compared to testimony from about 50 or 60 other people, not all of them refugees, veterans as well. That's like with Robert Bateman's book. Some of the veterans were upset with the book, but then some were relieved. But also, one of the soldiers said it was a slaughter. And the 8th Army published a book, said what really happened at No Gun Re. And it goes in there, one of the soldiers said it was a slaughter. It was a slaughter. But he wasn't talking about No Gun Re. He was talking about another battle that happened in Nak Dong. So the AP really misquoted a lot of people. So you can't trust what the Associated Press says about No Gun Re. Joe Galloway, who was in Vietnam as a reporter, not as a soldier, but as a reporter, he double-checked a lot of the AP sources and found a lot of things false. And Hal Moore, who Mel Gibson played in We Were Soldiers, fascinating movie, he wrote the foreword to Robert Bateman's book. Hal Moore was in Korea as well. So that's why No Gun Re was an incident, not a massacre. And the Koreans call it No Gun Re. No Gun Re Dali. That means No Gun Re Bridge. So, hope everybody's doing well. Take care. God bless, and bye-bye. Bye-bye.